Now, I haven't got the notes written up yet because I've only just finished these ones for chapter 9 in the last 10 minutes. But I tracked down the best answer that I could for the reason that Dan is not included in the list of the 144,000's 12 tribes.
Okay.
It seems that Dan was the senior tribe in a lot of ways. It wasn't necessarily recorded first all the time, but it was treated as one of the senior tribes, and it was the first tribe to be given land. It was the first tribe to actually be given a selection of land, and they weren't happy with the land they were given. So they actually were the first tribe to go to war with other tribes, and they moved themselves 2 or 3 times in the first 30 or 40 years. They caused a lot of problems with the Israelites. They were the first tribe to apostatize. They were the first tribe to go and break God's law. So the consensus, as far as I can tell, and it makes sense, is it seems that the black sheep of the family was more or less cut out, and Joseph's tribe was included twice instead of the regular ones. So It seems that that's it. Now, you have to remember that there were not technically 12 tribes in Israel, there were technically 13. Because, as you know, Joseph's tribes was split into 2, and the Levites are usually recorded on their own, but they're recorded separately because they didn't get a plot of land of themselves. They got cities amongst everything else. So it seems that when the rebuild of the 12 tribes of Israel happens, because there's no need for a temple in heaven, there's not going to be any need for a temple in heaven when we get up there, because there's no sin, there's no sacrifice need to be made. The Levites are more or less just accepted as another tribe, or in the case of Revelation, I think they're actually excluded, if I get the notes back up here. I think I'm right in saying that the tribe itself is actually not mentioned. Let me just get the text back up. That one. No, not that one. Sorry. There, completed, and then that one. So, yeah, they are mentioned. Joseph is mentioned, and Manasseh is mentioned. So the Levites are given their own thing, but there's another one. I think it is. Is it? There's one other tribe that's missing from here too. Not Gad. There's. I tracked it down, but there's a tribe that when Dan made their big attack, they upset the Ephraim. Are they not there? Yeah, I think it's Ephraim. No. Ephraim and Dan are the 2 tribes that first went to war with each other. And I think it's those 2 that are not mentioned in here because the Levites are treated like a regular tribe. Manasseh and Joseph are both given property to replace them. So it's sort of like cleaning house when you have the 144,000 move in. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah. So
I'm just checking. Dan was the son of Bilhah.
Yes.
And Bilhah was Rachel's handmaiden.
Yes.
So when Rachel couldn't have a child, Bilhah had some children on her behalf, and Dan was one of them. Okay.
Yeah, that's right. He had 4 wives, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Okay.
So that's the best way that I think it lines down to is that Dan was effectively the black sheep of the family. And they were the ones who aren't recorded because there's sort of, you don't want to have, well, there's no discord in heaven, so there's no need for it.
Yeah,
but again,
interesting.
These things are only symbolic. These are not literal tribes, they're just symbolic tribes. It's a recreation of the nation of Israel. So, yeah.
But it's still surprising that Joseph is listed. Because in listing Joseph, that means that a choice has to be made between the other two half tribes, Manasseh and Ephraim.
Yeah, Manasseh's recorded, but Ephraim isn't. So Joseph is, and I think Manasseh was the firstborn. So that makes sense. But you're right, there is still a splitting between tribe of Joseph and Manasseh. And Joseph is usually not recorded because he became an Egyptian. He changed his name to Zaphanath-Paneah, and he Egyptianized himself, but it was his children that became part of the 12 tribes of Israel. So it's rather interesting that they record Joseph as Joseph, as sort of a and again there's a mention of one or twice, two places there, that's a return to the fold, so to speak. You know, he's put off being Zaphanath-Paneah and he's now back as being Joseph.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's just sort of where it's
interesting. Thank you for having a look at it, James.
That's all right. This is fun. Yeah. So, in terms of chapter 9, we've already gone through chapter 8, and we've looked at the tribes, the 12. We've looked at the first 4 trumpets in chapter 8, and I'll just open it up here one more time so we can have a quick look over it. So we've started out with the actual concept that these are about, the prelude to the close of probation. The first trumpet, the vegetation, is struck, which we identify with the Jewish nations, Israel, and that sort of area. Then the broader world through the influence of the Christian churches, watching the destruction of Jerusalem, watching the transition between the Israelites to the Christians as the holy people. And then, of course, this star falling from heaven, bittering up the teachings until night finally comes. And this fourth trumpet, where night comes in, is rather fascinating because it's all of the world is bathed in this darkness, which we've established. When we get into chapter 9, however, this angel person comes back. When the fifth angel sounds, another star falls from heaven to the earth. Now, this would be a reference back to this star that falls in the third trumpet. So we can identify this very quickly and say that this is the angel that has been identified here as Satan. The star fallen from heaven was given a key to the bottomless pit. And he opens the bottomless pit, and smoke arises out of the pit, like the smoke of a great furnace. So the sun and air were darkened because of the bottomless pit. So we're making a comparison, we're making an overlay here back to the third and fourth trumpet. The star falling from heaven is clearly the star that falls in the third one. The darkening that happens because the darkening in the fourth trumpet happens because this bottomless pit is open. So this is a heralding of a time frame that we can see, which we've already identified as papal domination, which was the accumulation of a process that took a bit over 200 years from the liberation of the Christian churches by Constantine and such, and then it evolved into this papal domination where everything was dark, the ability to read was gone, the ability to access the scriptures was gone, all that sort of stuff happened. So we're getting some more information here, and we're seeing that this opening of a bottomless pit is affects this Christian church. Now, this is sort of where the hell doctrine comes from in a lot of ways in the Catholic Church. The smoke of a great furnace is done. But we have to look at this in the language, and becomes important. This is not from the smoke of a bottomless pit. John is using comparison here. It's like the smoke of a bottomless pit. He's not saying that there is a great furnace underneath the earth. He's saying that this is as if it was a great furnace. That becomes important as we keep reading through these trumpets. So, to understand, we look through, and we've already discussed. Now, I can go through. I've got a lot of notes here, but we can go through a lot of this rather quickly because we've already discussed a lot of things both in our study in Daniel and last week. And we can see that this darkness is this adversarial time that we have. But why did that adversarial time arise? That's a big question we have to look at. What was the impetus behind pushing this? Partly it was for the power of the popes, but also in part it was for things like the rise of Mohammedanism. So after the papacy started to stretch its own legs, giving you a quick overview, an Arab named Muhammad started to write of visions he received from the angel Gabriel, or he said he received from the angel Gabriel. He wrote a book which we call the Quran, and the Quran is the holy book of the Mohammedanist groups. Now, Islam, Mohammedanism are realistically synonymous. Mohammedanism is the old way of saying the archaic and more academic term because it covers things outside of the Islamic structure as well. There are typically 3 major parts to Islam, but there are something like 65 subgroups, and then there are a bunch of groups outside of Islam that don't accept that leadership. So Mohammedanism, Islam, it all comes to the same point of a fellow named Muhammad writing around the same time that the papacy started to launch large-scale missions around the world. We're talking about the 630s, and at that time, the first Gregorian mission was launched actually up to Anglo-Saxon England to convert the English to Christianity, what were then English, to Christianity. At that same time, in the Middle East, this sort of thing starts. So at the same time that the darkening of the world is expanding to the north, the popes are trying to expand their power to the north, in the east, a new force is rising. Now, Muhammad's claim was that he was directly inspired by the angel Gabriel, and he wrote his work that was the specific language and the exact dictation of the God he called Allah. He wrote it as if he was the third interpretation or the third development of the Christian and Jewish texts. So this is the next step. And this is very important to look at when we actually examine what Mohammedanism, what Islam says, and how it looks at things. It's important to note that they accept a lot of earlier texts. They accept the Aramaic scriptures. They accept those things. They accept that things like the Jews leaving Egypt and all that stuff happened. They accept Jesus as a prophet. They accept a lot of that sort of stuff. But there are very distinct differences. In Islam, Isaiah bin Miriam, or Jesus, son of Mary, is considered a prophet. He is acknowledged as the Messiah. He is acknowledged in Islam as the Messiah that has been demanded by the children of Israel, sent to restore them, and he has been given an Injil, a revelation that he develops. However, the Messiah in this case is not God. They reject the divinity of Christ. They accept him as virgin born. They accept 6 miracles. They accept he's accompanied by disciples. They accept him as pure. He is sinless. They accept him as being raised to heaven. But they reject his death on the cross. They reject his death, period. And they reject his divinity. What is interesting, though, is he is considered to be the precursor of the Prophet Muhammad. And according to the Quran, he will return at some point to stand with the Prophet and fight alongside against what they call Al-Misha and Al-Dajjal, which are known as Gog and Magog, as we will, which is language we will actually see in the book of Revelation. So according to the Quran, Jesus is a real person who really lived, and they accept him. And earliest traditions have some mixtures in with what we call Christian apologetics and trying to adopt interpretations of his life and death and resurrection, but by the time the Quran was formalized, that seems to have been thrown out. Now, he's mentioned 93 times specifically. Sorry, he's mentioned in 93 verses and over 180 times. He's probably the second mentioned person, 25 times by name, in third person 48 times, and he's given 35 different titles in the book. So there is a form of Jesus in Islam that is established, but by rejecting his divinity, by rejecting his death on the cross, by rejecting him as the sacrifice, and instead presenting Muhammad as a superior prophet, they have invented what we call a counterfeit Jesus, or an antichrist. Now, the word antichrist gets thrown around a lot, and I haven't used it up to this point because it's not everybody expects it to be a specific individual, but it's not a specific individual. It's a class of groups that are people who impersonate or try and replicate Christ. Does that make sense? It's not a specific person that is the Antichrist. It's something that tries to take the place of Christ. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
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 Yep.
So in Islam, there is a counterfeit Christ, or an Antichrist. There is a person who tries to take on that role, but doesn't do it very well. Doesn't actually hold that same sort of thing. But it didn't take very long for Islam to come into conflict with the Christian church, and they do accept things. Now, there was a number of discussions, even when the Prophet was alive, which we'll talk about one of in a moment, to try and get people to connect things up. And Jesus preaches that his followers should adopt the straight path. The language and the description of Christ being used in the Muslim texts is very, very similar to the Christ that we see in Christian text. The problem with the Muslim text is that they reject pretty much everything that came before them as being interpretive, as being overly out there, as being something that you can accept if you want to, but you don't need to take on anything more than face value. We've been discussing Paul, for example, very heavily and talking about the specifics of the way that he's using words, the way that he's putting in dates, and the way that he's referring to people. As far as Islam is concerned, you can go right ahead and do that, or you can reject it all, as long as you accept the Quran as the new gospel, as the new testament. So the third testament of Jesus Christ. This is where we've already seen in Daniel Islam coming into conflict with the Christian church, and the rise of Islam at around this time being mentioned in the 11th chapter, and we've already started to see this sort of thing come through. And as we know, by the time, the 750s rolled around, the Arabs controlled much of this part of the world. The Arabs forced their way up as far as the Rhone Valley in southwest third of France. The Muslim occupation of Spain lasted until 1491. There were major battles in France in 1719, 1732. They conquered basically the Middle East, Africa, North Africa, and as far into Babylon as they could in an extremely short period of time. Within, basically 130 years, they had conquered throughout the lot. And they had conquered all this area under only 3 small caliphates. So this is a very big and very forceful defeat. But of course, the reaction to this is what happened in Christianity. And this is where it becomes important for our side of the story when we look at this darkening, this black pit that arose, that we see as being reflective of the fourth trumpet. The response in Islam, in Christianity, was immediate and to freak out. The freak out that happened in Christianity actually came at a rather interesting time, because Christianity itself was starting to have a number of splits and a number of separations, and it wasn't until 1050 that this area was at its weakest. But to be able to invade Spain, which was heavily Catholic, get into France, and threaten these areas in the north of Italy, meant that the Christian church itself was under direct attack, but it was also under an intellectual attack by the claims that were being put on by the Islamic forces. The Islamics saying, we have the new interpretation of the New Testament of God as given by the angel Gabriel. So we have these texts that are coming into the realms of European Christianity that are also trying to intellectually attack people, which is again what we saw in the third trumpet, where this angel struck, and came from heaven and struck into these springs of waters, these teachers and these intellectuals. So these two trumpets are closely related to the events that are described at the beginning of this fifth trumpet. Are you with me? Are you still with me?
Yep.
All right. So this is a rather interesting connection. So the best physical conflict we know of course, is the Crusades. The Crusades were an accident in reality. And it actually happened because the Byzantine Emperor, Alexius Komnenos, which we've already talked a bit about, wrote to the Urban II and said, I want some knights to help defend me, because he was under attack. He owned Turkey at the time, and the Turks, the Muslims were starting to make inroads in, but they didn't get very far before the Europeans sent hundreds of thousands of people over. So we've already looked a bit at the Crusades, we've already studied in those, and we know that there are some major events. But what we can link in here is the connection to things like relics and the connection to doctrines, that were under the Muslim control. The relics that they had, for example, like the Holy Lance was discovered through the Siege of Antioch, the True Cross, all ended up in Islamic control. So there was this movement of physical equipment and doctrines over to Islam. But what also we find is that there is a movement back. The prayer beads that we see, has Trish got a rosary?
Oh, that's the beads they twist through their fingers and everything. Yep. Yeah, I don't. She hasn't got one, but I know what it is. Yeah.
So the rosary is actually an Islamic invention. Peter the Hermit, who preceded the Crusades, he was an unauthorized Christian leader, and he led the Rhineland massacres of Jews in 1096, went to the Middle East before the Crusades as a pilgrim, came back and brought back these sets of beads. Now in Islam, prayer beads have 99 beads to refer to the 99 names of God, and you say them as you twiddle the beads through your thumbs and fingers. In Christianity, the Christian Church has accepted this as a model, and the rosary and venerations of Mary are said as you rotate the beads through. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee, etc., etc. Each of the beads has a different piece for you to remember, and there are beads of different sizes. So this is an adoption directly of one of these false teachings or one of these false rituals that came from the Islamic world when the waters were struck and the teachers were inspired to bring these things back through, in this case, Peter the Hermit. So the pit of falsehoods that was opened up by Catholic dogma trying to sweep across the world, by Islam trying to open itself up to everybody, by the ritualistic demonstrations that came in through the Crusades, exploded at this time. So there's this massive outpouring throughout this 600, 750 era time of just these rituals and these ways of controlling people with rituals. It's no longer just the doctrines of Christianity, it's now the control levels that are starting to be laid down. And they're all being used through this spiritual indoctrination. So remember, the trumpets are based around this spiritual indoctrination. These are all in spirit. You have to say the rosary when you sin. If you go to a confessional, you can say you've got to say five Hail Marys and 10 Our Fathers. Those are parts of the rosary. So this spiritual indoctrination comes in. But these are also physical forces. It says here, then out of the smoke, locusts came up upon the earth. So from this smoke come locusts. These locusts are given power, as the scorpions on the earth have power. So they're given a level of dominion. They were commanded not to harm the grass of the earth, or any green thing or any tree, but only those who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. So if we take it as read that these locusts that come up are the Mohammedan forces, the Islamic forces that sweep through the Middle East and Northern Africa, we already know that these green things, green trees, and green grass are the Jewish forces. But the Jews and the Muslims today are bitter rivals. They are, thanks to the conflicts in Palestine and such, they are extremely bitter rivals. What we find, however, is that anti-Semitic feelings in the texts of Islam and in early Islam are extremely rare. They are very modern interpretations. The Rashidun Caliphate between 636 and 637, when they sieged Jerusalem, gave Jews the option to live inside the city of Jerusalem for the first time since the Roman rule. So the Muslims that conquered during this time actually opened up a lot of this area for Jews to return home. And they were extremely tolerant of Jews at this time. That does change, and that does become a difference, but when this trumpet is being blown, the actual toleration and connection with Jewish forces is really quite surprisingly graceful. But we have here 4 very clear groups that we can look at. There's the green grass, which we said is the Jews. We can see that there are the locusts, which we said are the Muslims. There are those with the seal of God in their foreheads, which we've already identified as being the groups that hold the truth, hold the Sabbath, hold to God's will, and those without the seal of God, those who don't. So the target of the locusts here is clearly those who do not have the seal of God. And at this time, the discussion amongst Byzantine is about whether or not they are going to start worshipping idols. We'll get to that in a moment. But we remember from chapter 7 that the sealing work has not commenced at this time. So there is the number of people that are actually able to be sealed, who are able to be protected, are small. Yet if we go back to our map here, we see that the link of where the Waldenses and such, who at this time were being persecuted, got to is well and truly outside of the threat of the Muslim invasions. So they're on the edge there, but they're still outside of that threat of the Muslim invasions. So the locusts are given the free will to torment those without God's seal, and they are told very clearly not to touch the green grass. So the torture that happens here is given to allow them to see where they've gone wrong, in the same way we've seen before. So this follows this pattern of God allowing pain to come across people without doing them too much damage so that they can see where they've gone wrong. In fact, it says clearly they were not given authority to kill them. So while they can torment and torture the Byzantine Christians and torment and torture the Roman Christians, they cannot kill them. They can't destroy them. They can only do that for 5 months. 5 months being 150 years. 5 times 30 prophetic days is 150 years. The torment is like the torment of a scorpion when it strikes a man. And in those days men will seek death and will not find it. They will desire to die, and death will flee from them. Now, do you guys have scorpions out that far?
Yeah.
Broken Hill, yeah.
Yeah, I thought you would. Have you ever been stung by one?
No, I'll kill them first.
The scorpion's venom is extremely intense. It's a neurotoxin usually, and it really hits deep into the skin. And to be struck by a scorpion, the stories that I've read, people are often very begging for death because of the extreme pain. But it says here that while the churches are going to be tormented that way, while these not sealed people are going to be tormented that way, they're not allowed to be killed. They're going to desire death, but it's going to flee from them. The Byzantine Empire held from, when it was starting to be attacked in the 600s, all the way through to 1453, as we saw. And there were many internal and external attempts to try and make the empire collapse. The Muslims are told here very bluntly, torment them, but you cannot kill them. So, we've already established a prophetic month is 30 prophetic days, 5 prophetic months, 150 literal years. The Byzantine Empire will be tormented for that period of time. So, let's get into the numbers. Now, here's where I'm going to disagree with the church again. John, please feel free to bite my head off. According to Uriah Smith, this time frame lasts from 1299 to 1449. The time frame that he uses is when Osman I, whom both he and Mrs. White call Othman, which is an archaic name, but no big deal, invaded Nicomedia on the 27th of July, 1299. Now, that's according to Edward Gibbon, who was one of the big prolific writers. He wrote a massive collection of books on the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, and it was first published from 1776 to 1789. So those 150 years therefore ended on the 27th of July 1449. The problem with that is that he puts that to the Battle of Bephaeus, and historians disagree with the dates, as Smith himself actually acknowledged at the time. That historians, by the time he was writing this in the 1830s and 40s, 60 years later, that was a different set of dates. The date that Gibbon used is miscalculated according to modern historians, and the date that should be put there is actually 1302. So the 150 years sort of falls apart there. It's also got a problem in terms of his dates that I like to jump in with, and say that it's very, very close. 1452 is very, very close to the destruction of the Byzantine Empire in 1453. And if you look at what that verse says, in those days men will seek death and will not find it, they'll desire it and death will flee from them, you actually get a situation where that's a bit too close to the destruction of the Byzantine Empire for me. Basically, I think that the language of that shows something a little bit different. Now, this may seem like academic, but I take the view that it's more closer to from 360 to 780. At the beginning of the rise of the Muslim forces in 629, they massed on the edge of Syria and finally invaded Syria in 630 and annexed the Levant from the Byzantine Empire in 638. Between then and 698, they just pushed forward through North Africa. They took the Egyptian provinces, which was the Byzantine food bowl. There was a civil war amongst the Muslims, during which time they were able to give some breathing space but still keep the pressure on the Muslims. Then at 678, Constantinople came under fire, but they were pushed back. A second civil war broke out, and there was a lot of raids up to about 780. And this is the time when most historians will put that 150-year period, and they'll lock that 150-year period down as being a brick of just Byzantine Islamic conquest. There's no one force that happens in Islam at this time. There's about 9 different caliphates that come up. There's a whole bunch of different groups. But between the 750s and 2080s, it forces the church to reconsider what it's doing. It forced the church to actually go back and reconsider how it was approaching its relationship with God. And between the 750s and 820s, they went through a period called iconoclasm, which was a debate about whether or not they would use major images and major pictures and those sorts of things on their altars in Christian churches, and more importantly, whether they would pray to them or not. So there was a humongous debate inside the church that led to a schism in 1054, where the Roman Church separated itself from the Byzantine Church. And that, in my opinion, fits better in these 5 months talk, because it leads directly to a reconsideration of what the spiritual part of the church is. It leads to a direct reconsideration of the spiritual movement. And that then led into Alexius being able to request the Pope for some Western support, by which he was maintained through, not destroyed, but tormented, and even went to war with the Christians in the Fourth Crusade, by the Christian Church and by the Eastern churches. So the Eastern Christians were able to be propped up, and even though they were constantly at war with the Arabs, they were not killed. They might have been begging to just let them rejoin, and begging to just, hand everything over to Rome, begging for this, but they had political differences, they had religious differences. They weren't able to until they were finally destroyed in 1453. So that's why I would say there is a better argument that this period between 630 and 780 matches these 5 months that we have in this, because then you have 300 years of real fighting and tormenting going before the destruction of the Byzantine Empire. Does that make sense? I've gone through a lot of academia there, but are you still with me?
It's good.
So you're saying it's five months, which is 150 years, but if that goes from 600 to 1,000, there's over 400 years.
No, 630 to 780.
That's when they had the wars.
That's the major portion of that tormenting time, yeah.
Right, fair enough. Yep.
630 to 780 is when that 5 months seems to fit, because it's at the Arabic rise. It's at the point when Muhammad himself is still around, so the big angel, if you will, is still there. It's where they are tormenting. There's no chance of either side actually winning, because they're both exhausted from other fights and from developing. But it fits better with this tormenting compared to other writers that you have. And yes, I'm going against what Fred wrote in his notes very clearly there. So that's... I'm growing up.
So are these guys that you're taking a different view to,
Yep.
Were they aware of the history just as you are?
They had an understanding there was something wrong, they didn't know what. Uriah Smith, in his book on Revelation, says that Gibbon's writing does not match what modern historiography says, but he couldn't explain why. And Gibbon himself said that these dates were open for interpretation. You got to remember, there's 300 years between us and Gibbon, so there's a lot of things that have changed in those 300 years. So I am not opposing the Adventist Church's view. I'm just saying that I think this fits better. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So you said also that the big angel was still around. So when did Muhammad die?
648.
Okay.
I think it was 632. So there you are. It's right at the edge of his life. So 630 to 632.
Okay. Yep.
So that's sort of how I just see how it connects in a little bit easier.
So what does it make any material difference to the prophecy, to the work, to the interpretation of the what's happening?
You could pretty much pick any date between 630 and 1300, and any period in that time, You have the Byzantines and the Muslims fighting each other, and any period within that time will allow you 150 years before the destruction of the Byzantine world. So in terms of, if we look at the text, it says, the fifth angel sounded, a star falls from heaven, he opens the bottomless pit, and smoke arises out of it. Out of the smoke comes locusts that are going to torment the earth. To them was given power as the scorpions of the earth have power. They were commanded not to harm the grass of the earth or any green thing or any tree. Before that full time, it wasn't until really the 1420s that they started to bring in, execution if you were a Christian, Muslim or not, or nothing else. So that fits again in that time frame. But own to those who do not have the seal of God in their foreheads, which again is pretty much any Christian church, and especially the Byzantines, because they were iconoclasts. They believed they worshipped idols. Authority was not given to kill them, but to torment them for 5 months. So if you take 1453 as the end date for that, one way or another, because that's when the Byzantines ended, any date between 600 and 1300, you've got a 700-year brick there that you can put any date you want in there, and they all fit. Their torment was like the torment of a scorpion when it strikes a man. In those days, men will seek death and will not die. They will desire to die, and death will flee from them. I think I've got a map here somewhere. You can see, if I zoom in a little bit, you can see how the empire moved and how it was defeated. So right at the beginning, it controlled much of the main part of the world. By the time you get to the siege of Constantinople in 717, it's lost the majority of its Eastern European and certainly its African holdings. Then Charlemagne comes in and it sort of pushes itself back and stabilizes up to around the time of the push in, and this here in 1080 is when the Crusades are starting to be considered. And then the Crusades come in, and the Crusades bring their own problems, because the Crusades, as you can see, the Christians actually force in and bite back at some of those. And in 1205, Constantinople itself is taken by the Christians. And that would be the point where you would say, okay, now's the time for the Byzantine Church to join up with the Roman Church. But it doesn't. It holds out. It keeps going. And then Nicolaitia comes back, the empire gets restored, and finally it falls in 1453. So if you pick any date from, say, this one here to about here, you've got a massive sea, and you can see just by that map that they are being pushed back, pushed in. You know, there's a lot of argument that death is on the horizon for them. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So.
Good job. Happy to go with the alternative view.
Yeah. Now, again,
there's a case for it. Anyway,
there's a case for it. I'm not saying that I'm right. I'm not saying that I'm wrong. I'm not going to oppose what the church has said, but I'm just making the presentation that this sort of fits as well. So, yeah. Now, the shape of the locusts is interesting. The way these are framed is rather interesting. The shape of the locusts is put as horses prepared for battle. On their heads were crowns of something like gold. Their faces were like the faces of men. Their hair was like women's hair. Their teeth were like iron's teeth. They had breastplates like breastplates of iron, and the sound of their wings was like the sound of chariots with many horses running into battle. They had tails like scorpions, and they had springs in their tails. Their power was to hurt men 5 months, and they had a king over them, as the angel of the bottomless pit, whose name in Hebrew is Abaddon, but in the Greek his name is Apollyon. One woe is past, and 2 woes are still coming after these things. John's language in this verse is rather interesting. He uses the word like 8 times. He says that the shape of their locust is like horses prepared for battle. Crowns is like gold. Faces like the face of men. He uses the word like 8 times in here. 2 of these symbols we've seen before. We've seen in the first seal when a rider came forward and he had a crown of gold and he had a horse that was prepared for battle and he was given the right to conquer and he was given the right to demonstrate his power. However, this is not said to be a horse prepared for battle. It's said like prepared to battle. This is not a golden crown. This is like a golden crown. These are counterfeits. These are counterfeits that use these same symbols but are not the real thing. And we don't want to go into the details of all of them and go into how women work and how teeth work and those sorts of things. So we'll stick to the first 2 because those are the connections here. The shape of their locus is like a horse prepared for battle. As we said, if we look at the map, when they came forward in this 5-month period, they were ready to conquer, but they didn't take on the big one. They didn't take on Constantinople. They didn't try and take on Rome. They didn't try and take on the big battles. And the connections inside Islam were so fractured, they were not ready to be able to take on. Islam had, I think I said, 9 caliphates in the first 300 years. It was not ready to actually move in. Furthermore, Islam today is still heavily separated. Islam today is split mostly between 2 groups, Sunnis and Shias, with Karawar making up a small portion of the rest. The Sunnis are about 90% of the overall Muslim population today, and the Shias make up most of the rest of the 10%. And this comes to a big discussion about who would succeed the Prophet when he died in 632. Abu Bakr was a close friend of Muhammad, and the Shias, the Sunnis follow the idea that he was just the natural successor, whereas the other group the Shia follow that it was the Prophet's cousin and almost adopted son. And these are the 2 groups that still have major sectarian violence. After the Iran-Iraq War, there was the Iran-Iraq War in 1980 to 88, which you guys will probably remember a lot better than I do. That was all a sectarian violence because Iran, one is Sunni, the other is Shia. The insurgencies have all been on insurgent grounds. So it's like prepared for battle, but it's not a horse that's really ready and unified for battle. It's not actually ready completely to take on an enemy. It's not fully prepared. And it's given crown because it's able to go and try and conquer things, but they could never sustain that conquest. Right? When the Christian church took over, the Christian church and the papacy has been established and was established for 1,000 years until 1798. It was in one form. It didn't go and mutate itself so many times. However, the Muslims were not able to that. The Rashid Caliphate was replaced by the Umayyads, which was replaced by the Abbasids, which then became the Ottoman Empire, just in that little period. So they're given the power to torment and hurt, but they're not given the power to fully dominate. They're given a crown like gold because it's not able to be certified and locked in as gold. It's not, and leaving aside even the purity, it's just not able to be that connection. So this is one of those points, and also when we consider just looking at the historiography of these, if we look at English history, we look at the monarchs of England. We follow from Edward to Edward to Edward to William, etc., etc. We follow one leader to another. There's no discussion amongst that until we get to the War of the Roses of a different group. And even with the War of the Roses, it's one English family fighting another English family, but the majority of England just keeps going. When you talk about this period in Islam, they are different caliphates. They are entirely different groups of leadership. They're entirely different political styles, leadership styles. The only unifying factor in this time frame for these groups, in fact, is the Prophet Muhammad. And that's where we can get this spiritual connection, because of course we're talking about these spiritual connections. It says they had as a king over them the angel of the bottomless pit, whose name in Hebrew is Abaddon, but in Greek the name Apollyon. Now, we didn't see his name when he was first mentioned in the 3rd trumpet. We didn't see his name here, but now he's given an actual name. Abaddon and Apollyon are both one Hebrew, one Greek word that mean the same thing. They mean destruction. So this angel that falls down from heaven is given a specific name. He is the angel of destruction. And when we see this word used in the Greek, in the Hebrew, it's always associated with death and almost always associated with the grave. So Job, the grave, Sheol, is naked before him, and destruction, Abaddon, has no covering. Destruction, Abaddon, and death stay. It is a fire that consumes to destruction, Abaddon. Right? Shall thy loving kindness be declared in the grave, Sheol, or thy faithfulness in destruction? Hell, Sheol, and destruction, Abaddon, are before the Lord. This is a rather not nice name in any way, shape, or form. But we have this individual here who we've identified as Satan, personified and described as a king over these people. Now, does that mean these people are evil? I'm going to say no. He is their leader, but he is not necessarily leading them in an evil fashion. We see that he is describing as a king over them, and in the spiritual realm he has led them to evil, but they don't know any different. We're not going to damn the Muslims and damn the Islamics in this place and in this area simply because they've grown up in that mindset. And in fact, if you look at the way that the analysis of the four groups that we saw before goes, there are four clear groups. There are those without the seal of God who have made a choice. There are those with the seal of God who've made a choice to follow God's word. There are those without. There are the locusts and the green grass. If the Jews can be left aside and left outside of these two groups, the Muslims should be able to too. So when we look at this, while Satan is using this power, that doesn't necessarily make the Muslims in this group evil. They're just leading destruction and leading the spiritual testing of God's people at this time. And this conflict was not always military. In October of 631, as I said, Muhammad had a delegation come from Najin, which is present-day Saudi Arabia, and they tried to debate the Prophet's views on Christianity and on the divinity of Jesus. They actually went to a point where Muhammad offered to pray a particular prayer, the Mahabala, which was a particular curse on whatever side was untruthful. So I might make the assertion that I'm wearing a blue shirt, and you may say, no, I'm going to contradict you, you're telling a lie, you're wearing a black shirt. And so we may say, well, I will pray the Mahabala, which is a particular prayer that Allah will curse me if I am lying, or curse you if you're lying. But when they reviewed this, the Christian elders, although initially accepting the principle, came to the realization themselves that neither side was lying. One side was certainly wrong, but they both believed intently what they were saying. This was a heartfelt belief. And the Quran itself says that the Christians should be respected as well as the Jews. Do not dispute the people of the book, save in the fairest ways, except for those who are evildoers. We believe in what has been sent down to us and what has been sent to you. Our God and your God are one, and to him we are submissive. The Muslims themselves accept that Christians and Jews are trying to do the right thing as they understand it. So there is an intention here that this is a spiritual power used or permitted by God to strike the Christian church, but that doesn't necessarily make them an evil power. It doesn't necessarily make them an evil force, just led by an evil intent. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
That's a really... I know that's radical to say, and I know that's something that's completely against what almost every Christian teaches, but that's the way that this seems to read to me. Does that make sense?
Yeah, they believe in God as well, and they've got... Well, they call him Allah, we call him God, and they've got their belief about him, we got our belief about him, and we're both all sort of pointing to the one direction.
Trying to, yeah. They're just led in the wrong direction.
Mm.
Are you still there, John?
Yep.
You're being very quiet.
Well, I didn't want to get any words in edgewise.
Yeah, no, that seems all right to me.
All right.
Keep it going, mate.
Okay. So then we have that's the fifth trumpet. So then we have the sixth trumpet sound, and this one's a bit quicker. The sixth trumpet sound, and I heard the voice of the four horns on the golden altar which is before God, saying to the sixth angel who had the trumpet, release the four angels who have been bound at the great river Euphrates. So the four angels who had been prepared for the hour, the day, the month, and the year were released to kill a third of mankind. Now this is the altar of incense. Again, we're going back to that temple language, and we're seeing that the four horns are where the sacrificial blood was sprinkled. These are the horns that heard all of the prayers of the saints. These are the horns that heard everything that the saints were asking for. This is where the incense comes from, and in fact, part of the point of the incense was to disguise the smell of blood here. And so this is where the horns are saying to the angel that holds the trumpet, dude, can you destroy these people? They are begging for it. Look at what they're praying. Listen to what they're praying here. They're crying out to the restraining wind, saying, come and strike them. because of the things that are going on. This is that papal domination coming back into play, where the papal domination is being demonstrated as being so selfish and self-interested that they're actually begging these restraining winds to be released, and that this group, the Byzantine Empire, is begging for its own destruction. They're under such extreme pain that they're trying to actually be released. Please let us get an opportunity to inspire these people to return to God's law. But it's interesting to note how the prophetic time is used here. These angels are not prepared for a certain amount of time. There's not a certain amount of time that they are prepared for. These are angels who have been held on so that they would be able to act for a certain amount of time. Right? The language uses these angels are prepared for the hour, day, month, and year. For the exact moment when they can be released, not for a hour, day, month, and year. So when we connect that up, one prophetic year is 360 prophetic days, one prophetic month, 30 prophetic days, and one day is one day. 360 plus 30 plus 1 is 391. And one prophetic hour is 2 literal weeks, so 391 years and 2 literal weeks. We'll evaluate how that matches up as we look at this conflict. But the number of the army of the horsemen comes up to 200 million. I heard the number of them. Thus I saw the horses in vision, and those who sat on them had breastplates of fiery red, hyacinth blue, and sulphur yellow. The heads of the horses were like heads of lions, and out of their mouths came fire, smoke, and brimstone. But these three plagues, by these three plagues, a third of mankind was killed, by the fire, the smoke, the brimstone which came out of their mouths. For their power is in their mouth and in their tail. For their tails are like serpents having heads, and with them they do harm. Now, like the 144,000, the 200 million is symbolic. It represents an overwhelming force, and it's designed to contrast the 144,000. It's an unassailable and unimaginably large a number of people in John's time. It's the sheer power that defeats the Christian Empire. So the 200 million, I'm going to say, is not a literal number. It's a symbolic number that just represents an overwhelming and extreme force. But the colours are interesting. The colours can be interpreted a few different ways. This is a Muslim battle flag that was actually taken by the Australian forces at Gallipoli, and you can see that it is a red background with gold writing. Red flags, with gold writing like this were very, very common, especially at this time, and senior leaders generally wore blue. So the three colours we have here, fiery red, hyacinth blue, and sulphur yellow, can be interpreted to be the uniforms of the officers and the flags that they hold. Additionally, Salahuddin Mohammed al-Bazour from the Ministry of Education in Jordan has associated and writes I was reading this a little while ago in the American Journal of Humanities, that the colours red, blue and yellow are apparently specific connotations to refer to Allah in the Quran. So he associates those three colours directly with Allah in the Quran. And also Ottoman uniforms were red, blue and yellow. They used those three yellows strongly because they were supported by the English, who wore red, and the French, who wore blue. Now red is an extremely difficult colour to make, and blue is a very expensive colour because it attaches itself to silks. So whichever of these you take, the fact that these three are referenced, yellow, sulphur, and red and blue are extremely high. These three colours represent wealth and influence. So they are representations of strong wealth and influence. And the heads of the horses were like the heads of lions, and out of their mouth came fire, smoke, brimstone. Now brimstone can better be translated sulphur. And this is the best connection we have to the siege of Constantinople. That was the first time gunpowder had been used on a large scale in Europe. It had been used in smaller weapons before, but in 1452, when a fellow named Orban went to the Hungarian officers in Constantinople and said, "I know you're about to be attacked by the Ottoman Empire, and I want to sell you and give you the ability to build extremely large cannons." And we mean this sort of massive cannon size. David, you could easily lie down in that nicely. This is a big cannon. The Byzantines said they can't afford it, and we don't think that it's going to be necessary, and we think we're going to win because God's on our side. So Orban went over to Sultan Mehmed II and said, hey, I think that my cannon could blast the walls of Babylon itself. And he built 70 of them. So when they turned up at the Siege of Constantinople in 1452, 70 of these cannon, and each one of these was dragged by 60 oxen from Constantinople, 70 of these size of cannon turned up. These cannon use gunpowder. They don't use modern nitrates and things, they just use gunpowder. Gunpowder is made from charcoal, saltpeter, and sulfur, and it creates a humongous amount of smoke. So by the fire and smoke, fire from the gunpowder, smoke the result, the smell of brimstone, which comes out of the mouths of these massive cannons. This is the first time that cannons are used in this big attack. This one here is specifically known as the Basilica, or the Great Cannon of the Dardanelles. It was actually used in 1807 when the British tried to invade the Turkish, and they actually kept it from that long. That's not from the Siege of Constantinople, but it's close. So they're that sort of size. And they were there. So when we look at this language, we can connect this up. But we also need to connect this to the 391 years. And the historiography works up. Now, Uriah Smith and I both put this to the fall of Constantinople, which is the destruction of basically half of Christendom and the loss of the holy sites. So from this point, the holy sites really have never been able to be adopted or reabsorbed by Western Christian groups. They are today most of them are today under Israelite conquest or under Israelite control, but really they haven't had any major connection. When the siege of Constantinople actually happened on the 29th of May 1453, they were able to attack a weak part of the north of the city, which had not been really repaired since the 1100s, and the 80,000 attackers simply overwhelmed the 7,000 Byzantine defenders, and the Venetian trading ships said that blood flowed in the city like rainwater in the gutters. So it was a massive destruction. The Ottoman Empire made that their new capital, and it was their capital until Turkey fell, and after the First World War had a number of civil wars, and the Republic of Turkey, which is what remains today, was established. Now, when we connect up this 391 years, this, as I said, a day, month, and year, we want to try and connect that as close as we can to this fall of the Constantinople, because that's when these events, this specific type of language happens. Can we make a connection there? Well, by the 1820s, the empire was in a major decline, and they went to war with Egypt 2 or 3 times, and they effectively had to sign over their sovereignty in the Convention of London of 1840 to a group that was comprised of the United Kingdom, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, so that they could be propped up by the Europeans. The Europeans were worried that if the Ottoman Empire fell, there would be a major European war that they were trying their hardest to avoid, which ended up being one of the big kickers for the First World War, and they were trying their hardest to stop the Ottoman Empire from falling. So they were propping it up for quite a long time. And in the light of this Convention of London of 1840, on the 21st of March 1844, the Sublime Portent of the Ottoman Empire, which was the equivalent of their parliament, issued a letter to the British and French saying that they were going to stop executing apostates for Islam. And over the course of that year, I haven't put the details in here yet, but I'll get to that. Over the course of the rest of that year, the pressures on people becoming Islamic turned around and said, we are not going to put any pain on you. Now, the Bahis call this the Edict of Tolerance. And if we add 1453 to 391, and 29th of May to the 14 days, we get the 12th of June. That edict was written up on the 21st of June, and I've just read that there was another law passed on the 12th that was the final conclusion of toleration. So toleration from anti-Christian sentiments, the actual depression, was held for a day, a month, and an hour, a day, a month, and a year. That prophecy itself fits in very nicely when we connect this up to these destructions. And again, this 1/3 element which we said, a specific thing, the city of Constantinople was held for that amount of time until now Christians could come into the city happily. So even that vague language fits into this sixth trumpet. But the rest of mankind not killed by these plagues did not repent of their works of their hands, that they should not worship demons and idols of gold, silver, and brass, which they could neither see nor hear. They didn't repent. The rest of the world outside the Byzantine Empire, the Roman Christians, didn't make any difference to them. The sixth trumpet is described in these last verse, as a failure. Jesus himself says that this sixth trumpet was a failure leading into the time frame of 1844. Leading into the time frame of 1844, the church was being rocked, it was being shattered, it was being moved, it was being dramatically told to repent, and not much ended up happening. And the Catholic Church today is still the way that it is. So these six trumpets, although they shook the church, they spiritually made it consider itself, made it look into itself, actually did not accomplish much at all. But, as we're going to see, there are some interesting things that are yet to happen in the next 2 chapters before we get to the seventh trumpet. Questions? That one's one. That chapter is one of those ones that sort of makes you really thunk, because it's everything is to do with another part of the world and makes you go, okay, yeah.
Yeah, when they took, I've seen shows on the taking of Constantinople,
Mm-hmm.
and they actually dragged those cannons over nearly a mountain.
Yep.
To come out on the opposite side of the river, because they used to have a chain or something going across the front that the Ottomans and that couldn't get in. Their boats couldn't get in because they'd hit on the chains and it'd sink their boats.
Yep.
That they actually dragged these cannons up over, I'll say massive hills. Mm-hmm. And they sat them on the opposite side and, blew the crap out of the wall, and then virtually carried their boats over, put their boats in up the channel further, and then come sailing down and went in.
That's right.
That's pretty much how they conquered Constantinople.
Yep. It was a bloodbath. It really was, and it was.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, the Ottomans were not entirely Muslim. There were Christians that had signed up with the Muslim powers that were leading the charge. They were the first ones in. So you're right. It was a real brutal thing. But the important part of this is still that this is when the Christian church is being rocked, and when the time frames all match up, still like we saw in Daniel. So I've got a little bit more work to do on this before I upload it for you, but it's almost done.
The interesting thing for me about this is just the history. I don't know any of this history. So
I didn't know much until I started reading the Quran.
Okay.
Which is an interesting book. It's a really fascinating study.
Yeah, the only reason I know about them is I've been watching like a History Channel and a few like documentaries and all like that on, like Constantinople, the taking of Constantinople and all like that. But yeah. So the way those cannons was something like 2 foot round.
Yeah,
in the barrel.
They were massive, and they were cast from solid bronze, as it says here. They're in 2 pieces, but they're just tremendous sizes. Yeah.
Yep, they were firing them, and they kept firing and firing and firing, and in the end, a couple of them they actually blew the cannons to pieces because they were running so hot.
Yep, and of course they didn't have much in the way of making sure the gunpowder was good either. So yeah.
No, there was a lot of heat that was produced in the firing of them, and in the end, some of the cannons did fracture.
Wow. Good job, James.
Cool.
Yeah, it's excellent.
All right, so let's end with a prayer and we'll shut things down. So, Heavenly Father, we thank you once again that we can come together for the last time this year to discuss your word and to review your prophecies for us. We thank you that you have been so diligent in securing and timing these prophecies together. And we thank you that even though there are changes in dates and changes in times, that we are able to connect these prophecies together. We thank you, Lord, for the effort that has been put into your book so that we can study it, and we thank you that it gives us the assurance that your word is real. Guide and direct us as we break over the Christmas holidays and bring us together, we pray, in your holy name. Amen.
Amen.
That's something else I should have mentioned. There is an old date, new date thing when the Gregorian calendar was brought in too. So I've got to take that into account when I write that little section up. But other than that, it's all good.